All right, very, very happy to be talking to you, Claudia, today. And let's start off with, how do you help people?
Well, thank you, Helen, for having me here with you today. I'm really honored to be here. So my name is Claudia de Pasquale, and I am a success acceleration coach and mentor. And what I do is I remove limiting beliefs for professionals around their career success by helping them step into their personal power, providing strategic planning and a clear vision so that they can transition into a career which is aligned with who they are.
Wow. So, and when you talk about transitioning into a career, do you mean that that's people that they need to move to a different company, or is it something that they can potentially do in the company that they're already working in?
Well, actually, I help people in several cases. I can help professionals, mainly highly skilled and qualified professionals, who find themselves being either stuck in their position or unhappy and even frustrated, to review their situation at work. And this can be either we start reconsidering what can be changed within their own corporate environment and within even their same department, or what do we need to do and start reflecting on in order for us to take us out from an environment which doesn't fit us anymore. And at the same time, what I also help people with is if they realize that being employed is not their thing anymore, and this can happen to people after 10, 15, 20 years of very dedicated employment work, they realize, actually, I want to do something completely different, but how do I get myself into starting my own business? How do I use all the skills and the resources I learned? How do I use them and transpose them into a new role? So on several levels, I can definitely accelerate people's success within their careers.
Wow, that's amazing. I think this is going to be a great discussion that we're going to be having, because people can learn from your expertise in that area. But also it's really interesting because you are a non-native speaker of English, and many of the Sasaga podcast listeners are non-native speakers of English. So I'm sure they're going to enjoy learning from you. And I have a bunch of usual questions that I ask on these interviews. And I'd like to start with the first one of, what sort of communicator would you like to be?
Right. Actually, I have to say one main value of mine is authenticity. And authenticity in the sense of being true to who I am. And this reflects itself as well into my speaking English. In any other foreign language I could speak, in the sense that what is really important to me in being a good communicator is that I am true to who I am and to my values. This is really extremely important to me. So, especially because in the moment I work with people who are, many of them native speakers, I find myself into the situation, kind of the clinch situation where I have to think, okay, do I want to stick to a perfect grammar and perhaps not get my message across? Or do I want to more really get across what I really mean? And in this case, what I decided within time, because I've been talking English for quite some decades now, is that staying true to what I really want to say is much more valuable to me personally. And what I also see, Helen, is that on the other side, there's always been acceptance, and there's always been understanding. If sometimes my grammar wasn't 100% perfect, that was totally fine for the native speakers listening to me. And for those who are not native speakers, it's like we find ourselves in the same situation. So authenticity has always paid back to me.
Right, because what I hear from a lot of my clients and my community is that kind of fear of, you know, the grammar has to be correct, the pronunciation has to be correct, the words have to be perfect. So you're saying that doesn't have to be like that. It's more about being you and saying the message that you want to say.
Well, I think we can make a choice there, right? We can decide what is more important to us. Is it more important to look as if we are perfect, which is actually, we both know that's idealistic because perfection doesn't exist. We can strive for excellence. And I have to say, in the moment you ask me what kind of communicator I want to be, after 30 years of speaking English, I realized actually being authentic is much more valuable to me than striving for perfection, which I will never attain in speaking English. English is such a nuanced language. They have, you guys have so many layers of differentiations within words and verbs and idiomatic verbs, which is basically almost impossible for a non-native to get to the level where you are. And nowadays, I have to say, I'm totally fine with that.
Right. So I want to first of all ask you, how many languages do you speak?
Okay, so I grew up bilingual with German and Italian.
Right.
And then I learned from when I was 12 years on, I learned English and then I added French to this. So I would say I'm pretty fluent French and English, almost at the same level.
Yeah.
And I'm native in both German and Italian.
Oh my goodness. I can imagine our listeners now thinking, wow, it's hard enough just to work with English, let alone all those other languages. So, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, English, by the way, is my favorite foreign language.
Why?
I really adore English because of what I just mentioned. You have so many different ways of expressing situations. I remember when I learned the word tickling.
Tickling.
And yes, tickling or dripping or anything which has to do with the drop falling. I remember when I looked that up, I was blown away. You had something like 5 ways of expressing how a drop of water can fall down on the floor. And I was, wow, that's really fascinating to me. And I think this realization of how many layers of expressing one simple act, which is Italian, is very simple. A drop just falls, right? Just showed me that it's actually unattainable for somebody who is non-native, and that it's much easier perhaps to stay to what I really want to say without going too much into details, because it's kind of almost impossible for me.
Right.
And I'm okay with that now. After 30 years, it took some time. But it's okay.
So on those 30 years, I'm sure you've had some successes in terms of your communication. So what would you say is a kind of success lesson or a success story that you can share with the Sasaga podcast listeners?
So one period of my life which I will never forget is when I started to coach in English. I really got blocked in my advancing by my perfectionism, right? Because I wanted to speak an almost perfect, if not really perfect, English. And when it was about holding longer conversations and deeper conversations and talking about more detailed stuff like you do in a coaching conversation, I realized there's no way I'm never going to be there. So what do I choose? Do I choose to be an effective coach? Or do I choose to get myself entangled within perfect grammar and the 100 ways of expressing how a drop falls, for example, right? So I remember that period of my life being very difficult for me because I had to really take choices and decide, okay, do I want to be more effective or do I want to stick to perfection? And I have to say, it was and it still is, it's very dear to my heart that my clients achieve their objectives within a coaching process. So I really realized, but it took me quite some time. I would say it took me at least 6 months to 9 months to realize, okay, I will have to let this perfection and this grammar addiction go. And I'm going to dedicate myself more to the essence of what I want to communicate. That was, I will never forget the struggle I had around this.
I love that. Let go of your grammar addiction. I think
Yes.
maybe that's the podcast title. I don't know. I always think of the title after we've had the interview, but that could be that could be a possibility. So in those early days, you said it was a struggle. So do you have like a failure story, like an in quotes failure story, or a struggle in particular that you can share that we can gain some insights from?
Well, I remember the first time I was coaching an American client. There's not specific an anecdote, but there was this, even my willingness to be perfect on the terms of the speed. And Americans, they talk very quickly. They can talk very quickly if they want. Even British people can, and Australians as well. But Americans, it was the first time I was coaching an American client. And I tried to keep up, to kind of mirror the speed of my client. And it was just impossible. I realized you're not going to get your questions, your coaching questions across. I had an internal dialogue, and I was just, during the session, I said, that's not what you want to achieve. You want to be an effective coach and be very, very impactful with your questions. But if I was insisting on delivering them at the speed I decided to talk to, no chance. So that was one moment where I realized, really, now you just let it go and just be yourself and talk the way you are with your rhythm. And I told myself, and it will be fine. And in the moment I decided to be truer to who I am and how I was able to speak English, I got lots of admiration back, and I got much more attention back and empathy back. I never had any experience, Helen, I really want to emphasize that, any experience where I did a mistake or where I said something perhaps in a completely different way from how a native person would say, that I had a negative feedback from a native speaker. Never, ever.
Wow. So
I realized it was all my own train of thoughts, which was going around, oh my God, am I going to fail? What is this person going to think? And that's, honestly, that's so useless in order to be an effective communicator.
Right, exactly. This is something I talk about quite a lot with my clients and my community, is that even though we're focusing on communication with other people, it's the communication with ourselves. It's what we're telling ourselves that drives everything and is most important. So we need to be telling ourselves positive stories that we can communicate, we can just be ourselves, and that's when it works out.
Yes. One of the positive stories I learned pretty early to tell myself is directly talking to myself internally while I am triggered to go into perfection. I decide and I tell myself, no, you don't remember now how you need to, you're supposed to say it. It's okay. Just say it the way which comes up to you. Everything is going to be fine. when I give myself permission to say it the way it comes up in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit I never got negative feedback. Never, ever. People have always been very, very kind with me. And even, I have to say, even some admiration, because I was putting the effort in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We often don't realize how much native speakers admire our effort to speak their language.
Yeah.
They
So
really
true.
do.
So true.
That's my
Yeah.
experience with native speakers
And
around.
especially when you're talking about English, because
Yeah.
there are so many people who English is their native language and it is the only language that they speak. So yeah. So it's so funny that it's, you know, if I think of the Japanese people who are speaking English and they're like, oh, I'm no good, I'm no good. And it's only they're the ones who are telling themselves that. It's not the people outside who are telling them that.